So have you ever stopped to wonder, what actually builds an unbreakable cultural identity? I mean, when a society is just slammed with invasions, colonial pressure, or even internal collapse, why do some cultures completely disintegrate while others forge a legacy that literally lasts for centuries? Well, today we're diving deep into exactly that. We're looking at how foundational myths, raw military might, and profound spiritual resilience combine to shape the very DNA of a culture.
To really wrap our heads around this, we're going to look at two completely distinct regions at two totally different points in history. First up, we'll examine 16th century Hausaland in present-day Nigeria, a whole era defined by empire building and serious military prowess. And then we're going to fast forward to 19th century Senegal, right during the height of French colonial expansion, where the battleground actually shifted from physical territory to the realm of the spirit. Welcome to The Explainer. I am so incredibly thrilled to guide you through this material today. Our big overarching theme here is architects of identity, charisma and resilience in West Africa. We're going to explore how visionary, deeply charismatic leaders manage to protect and elevate their people using, honestly, entirely different playbooks. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. First, origins of Hausaland. Second, Amina, the warrior queen. Third, Senegal's peaceful existence. Fourth, Bayfall, the work ethics. And finally, number 5, enduring West African legacies. Let's get right to it.
Part 1. Origins of Hausaland, the power of myth and trade.
You know, before you can build a sprawling empire, you kind of need a foundational myth, something that glues disparate people together. And according to the source material for the Hausa people, that origin story centers right around the legend of Baiji Dida. So the story goes that Baiji Dida was this wandering hero who rocks up to the city of Daura. Now the city's only well is being guarded by this massive, terrifying snake. Naturally, Baiji Dida draws his sword, slays the snake, and frees the water supply. The people go wild, and the local queen, Daura, ends up marrying him. It's your classic hero's journey, right? But historically speaking, its function was absolutely crucial, because from their lineage came the founders of the original Hausa States. It gave everyone a unified, shared identity.
And that legendary lineage gave birth to the Hausa Bakwai, which literally translates to the 7 true Hausa States. What is just brilliant about this setup is how highly structured and uniquely specialized these states became. It's kind of like a giant puzzle where every single piece has a very specific job. Daura was the birthplace and spiritual center. Kano, that became the commercial powerhouse, basically the ancient Dubai of West Africa, totally famous for its indigo dye pits. Katsina was the seat of Islamic scholarship. Zazzau handled the military and trade engine. Gobir bred the fierce warriors for regional defense. Rano was the hub for textiles and crafts. And Biram held the whole shebang together by preserving ancient traditions. Working together, they were this incredibly interconnected, highly specialized commercial machine.
Moving right along to part 2, Amina, the warrior queen.
So zooming in on Zazzau for a second, Queen Amina takes power in the late 16th century. This is about 200 years before the Sokoto Caliphate Federation, just to give you some context. And let me tell you, she was not just some figurehead, she was a fierce boots-on-the-ground battlefield commander. During her 34-year reign, she commanded a whopping 20,000 soldiers. Plus, she was a major innovator. Because her people were already these talented metalworkers, the sources tell us she actually introduced iron helmets and chainmail to her army. She spent almost her entire reign fighting, pushing her kingdom to its absolute greatest borders in history and raking in unheard of wealth. We're talking gold, new crops, and huge tributes like thousands of kola nuts.
And she completely defied the patriarchal norms of her day. The sources highlight this famous, incredibly powerful moniker she earned, Amina, daughter of Naikata, a woman as capable as a man. Legend even has it that she flat out refused to take a traditional husband and would instead choose a temporary partner from the ranks of vanquished foes after a battle. I mean, wow, think about that for a second. In pre-colonial Nigeria, where gender roles were usually pretty strict, she proved that a woman with immense merit and royal kinship could absolutely seize total authority.
Now, what's absolutely fascinating here is the sheer scale of the earthen walls she had constructed. Amina is credited as the master architect of these massive fortifications built around the cities she conquered. They literally became known as Ganuwara Amina, or Amina's walls. And look, these weren't just big piles of dirt. They were the prototype for fortifications across all the Hausa States. Sure, they provided essential physical security against theft and invasion, preventing uncontrollable sprawl, but politically, they were highly prestigious. Just the immense size of these walls acted as a huge psychological deterrent. They were a powerful symbol of a ruler's ability to command labor and keep their people safe.
It was absolutely vital to their cultural survival.
All right, shifting gears to part 3, Senegal's peaceful resistance.
So let's pivot across West Africa and jump forward to 19th century Senegal. At this time, the traditional kingdoms of the Wolof people were literally collapsing under super aggressive French colonial expansion. The traditional animist warriors, these guys were known as the Chado, well, they were defeated. The old kings and traditional elites completely lost their status. So you have this massive political and existential vacuum. The people desperately needed a new kind of protection, a completely new way to define themselves against the colonizers. Enter Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba. He was a Muslim ascetic and an incredibly charismatic spiritual leader who steps right into that void.
So the crucial point here is how Bamba reacted to this crisis. He purposefully replaced the sword with the spirit. While other leaders were calling for armed rebellion against the French, which, by the way, was proving to be pretty disastrous, he promoted this concept of Jihad al-Akbar, or the greater jihad. But instead of physical combat, he meant an internal, spiritual struggle. It was all about fighting your own inner moral evil, diving into scholarship, and finding salvation through pure devotion rather than violence. This pacifist approach was a real game changer. It essentially completely disarmed the colonial justification for destroying his movement, while simultaneously giving his people this incredibly powerful, untouchable inner resilience.
Bamba went on to found the Muridiyya Brotherhood, which is this really original, localized form of Sufi Islam, and he preached a philosophy that is summed up perfectly in this quote right here: "Work as if you'll never die, and pray as if you'll die tomorrow." Now, the French administrators, they still found him incredibly threatening just because of his massive, devoted following, so they actually exiled him to Gabon for 7 years. But honestly, that backfired spectacularly on them. Exile only fueled his legend. These incredible stories started spreading like wildfire among the Senegalese. Like, there's a legend that he miraculously survived being thrown into a den of hungry lions, simply because his profound spiritual aura quite literally put the lions to sleep. So he returns from exile not as this broken, defeated man, but basically as a living saint.
Which brings us to part 4, Bath Fall, the work ethos. Now, within Bamba's Muridiyya Brotherhood, this highly visible subgroup pops up, founded by his single most devoted disciple, a man named Ibrahim Fall. And this brilliantly illustrates the dynamic between the two leaders, which is just striking. You have Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, ascetic, wearing simple, traditional white robes, literally the picture of quiet, scholarly contemplation. And then you have Ibrahim Fall. He actually came from a noble warrior lineage, but when he pledged himself to Bamba, he threw himself 100% into physical service. Fall's followers today, the Bakwai Fall, often wear these vibrant, colorful patchwork clothes, sport dreadlocks, and practice a highly energetic, almost ecstatic devotion. It is such a sharp, fascinating contrast to Bamba's quiet scholarship.
What Ibrahim Fall essentially did was radicalize the Murid work ethic through this concept of khidma. For the Bakwai Fall, khidma means that physical labor and absolute, unwavering submission to your spiritual guide isn't just some chore you have to do, it is divine spiritual service. It is literally the path to salvation. In fact, Ibrahim Fall actually substituted the traditional Muslim pillars of fasting and daily prayers with just relentless, grueling hard work for his guide. We're talking farming, chopping wood, drawing water. He basically showed his followers that you could find God through the sweat of your own brow.
And to really cement this incredible culture of loyalty, Fall established these strict, unwavering codes of devotion. Check out these 5 rules of respect. Never stand on the same level as the sheikh. Never greet him wearing a hat. Never walk ahead of him. Always kiss his hands. And always lower your voice in his presence. Fire those off and you can see how this strict structure of total deference created a deeply unified, incredibly loyal, and frankly an economically productive community that is still thriving to this very day. Let's move to part 5, Enduring West African Legacies, and see how this all builds together. If we compare their legacies, just side by side, it reveals a really striking contrast. Queen Amina and Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba were both master architects of identity. They were just using completely different blueprints. Amina's legacy in Hausaland, it is written in the earth itself. The Gunwar Amina walls and the massive trans-Saharan trade networks she solidified are still influencing northern Nigeria today. On the flip side, Bamba's Muridiyya legacy is highly visible in the autonomous holy city of Touba. It's this massive metropolis managed entirely by the Brotherhood, and the Grand Magal pilgrimage there draws literally millions of people every single year. So Amina used the sword and physical fortification, Bamba used the spirit and economic labor, but both of them successfully built lasting cultural fortresses that protected their people from being erased. Which brings us to a final, pretty provocative thought. We've seen how a 16th century warrior queen and a 19th century pacifist saint both managed to create these unbreakable cultural identities that easily survive the test of time. It really makes you wonder, if earthen walls and immense spiritual devotion were the structures that preserved these cultures for centuries, what structures are we building today to define and protect our future? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. I really hope it sparked some curiosity for you to go out and learn even more.